Okay. Let me see. I'm just checking that I'm seeing. I see Daniel. I see Valeska and Fernanda. Okay. Yeah. Thank you. So many people in my screen right now. Okay. I also wrote an R script to randomize this. So the R script said that Valeska goes first, then Daniel goes second, and then Fernanda goes third. Sorry, R. So if you're ready, Valeska, you have 5 minutes.
Okay. I'm a little bit surprised anyway. Can I share? Thank you very much indeed for this opportunity. It's I would say a very challenging one, but anyway, I want to use this this framework presented in some time ago in a neighborhood SALURBAL section in last year. Just thinking about how we could think in a conceptual approach in terms of this very rich and very singular data set. And congratulations to all, because it's really amazing to see how this is moving so fast, because it's a very hard work. So I was thinking just to approach the measure, the estimate of time-dependent mean exposure, measure the potential urban effect modifiers like urban growth, green space, PM 2.5, so on, apply the methods, the EPI methods in function of the urban effect modification, and of course compute mortality, excess of mortality, or by education, by aging, by any level. I'm not very demanding. I'm just thinking broadly in terms of the L1AD, L2, L2.5, but I'll speak a little bit about that. So when I try to separate the vital statistics in terms of trends and change, of course, it depends the data availability, and of course the L1AD is available for the 11 countries. But sometimes we may be able to do some regional or country specific analysis. I've heard yesterday that the life expectancy is in progress as a proposal. And thinking about causes specifically, I'm very biased toward the infectious disease, especially the vector disease. And I think this is a great opportunity to look at some vector disease in terms of climate zone, temperature, air pollution, urban features, work and transport features, built areas, winds, population characteristics. It's a really, really rich possibility that we can, and especially infectious disease, because infectious disease, it's very hard to deal with the boundaries in terms of small L2s, let's say, because if you think about dengue, for instance, we always think, well, what is going on around the one municipality boundary or whatever. The road traffic, there is something on the motorcycle phenomenon, especially in some specific country related to socioeconomic, as was mentioned, the GDP, Gini, and perhaps another economic variables, because also the road traffic is, there are some articles relating road traffic to temperature variation, which I think it's quite interesting as well. For the homicides, I found this, in fact, I didn't find, the Brazilian team helped me in this presentation. So there is this very interesting paper in the LaTeX trajectory of cross-national homicide trends, we're using characteristics of underlying groups. Suicidal rates, I think, and for instance, green space proximity by gender, I think that's a great opportunity, because suicide is a very rare phenomenon, luckily, fortunately, but it's a possibility that we could think about that. Well, I think for infant mortality and birth outcomes, a lot of ideas and proposals are in progress. And another thing that we thought that would be the mortality profiles according to group of causes, like Usama, like the Usama's paper over time, in relation to population, the back variables, using some socioeconomic markers, as was mentioned before, and if possible, we are a little bit demanding, some democratic and neoliberal federal government mandates. I think this is not, it's not bad, a very difficult data to get, at least for countries. And we cannot forget the ancillary studies, because I think some ancillary studies, they may be able to see intra-urban differentiations right now in terms of mortality and interventions. For survey data,
you can start closing.
Yes, I just will mention hypertension, because I think hypertension, as Anna showed yesterday, has some, very interesting contradictory finds. And I encourage everyone to read the very nice paper from Nancy Olmedo from the Mexico team, because it's a very nice one that can be used for this kind of things. Anyway, so I have all those informations here. And finally, I was going to ask something about the L1 UX, because I think this is a great, interesting data that we can look at over time in terms of urban growth. And other things about this single multiple way to see the variables, we can discuss this later. Thank you.
Thanks, Valeska. Okay, Daniel, I think you're next.
Thank you, Valeska. That was great. I don't have slides, but I want to be kind of simple and highlight three main points that I actually build very well on what Valeska just presented. The first one is something that came up yesterday, and it's that I would encourage everyone to not underestimate the power of description as an easy way to communicate with decision makers and with policymakers. And so here we have changes over time, from my perspective, in terms of greenness, the built environment, other built characteristics, and even heat. Right, and all of these are related. And just describing how the region has been changing, Valeska pointed to a very interesting methodology on trajectories as a potential way of exploring this, but thinking innovatively about ways of presenting those changes over time to describe the patterns to start with, I think is very powerful. The second point is, given those patterns, try to explain them. So what explains that growth? Is it GDP? Is it certain proximity patterns? Is it certain policies? That's a little trickier, but it might be that if we think about changes in heat or changes in segregation or inequality, we can have other predictors that are helping us understand that. And the final point is, I think the one that we're all interested in here is the built environment and the physical environment as predictors of many of these outcomes, right? I think the great option that opens up with this longitudinal data is to be more careful about exploring kind of baseline effect. These are very distal effects, thinking about hypertension, diabetes, metabolic syndrome, obesity, et cetera, et cetera. So we might be able to go back. We can now be able to go back and do measurements much earlier, 1990, 1995 maybe, and be able to use those variables as predictors and give us, I think, a little more power in terms of causality, just because of the time dimension, to be able to make stronger statements. So those are the three things that I wanted to highlight, kind of the basic description on understanding some of those associations in changes on the physical environment, and then using the physical environment characteristics at baseline and the changes to explain some of the health outcomes that we're interested in. Thank you, Sama.
Thanks, Daniel. Okay, now last one is Fernanda.
Hi, everybody. First, thank you to the team, Kari, Goro, Yanni, have done great amount of work putting together all these data sets together. And I'm also want to thank to Monica and Mariana, as they gave me very good insights prior to this meeting and very good comments that are very helpful for this discussion. So I'm going to focus more on the survey L1 data that is available, as I'm more familiar with the data. And one of the first recommendations we will be first looking at the time frame that is available, since it varies across countries. And as Kari showed, the time frame goes from 6 years from Brazil to 18 years in Mexico. Most of the countries beginning in the mid 20,000s until more recent days, more or less an average of 12-year period for the 5 countries that had survey data available. So one of the first questions will be to think about what changes or what associations have occurred in the time frame that is available that is interesting to look at. And we also need to dig in deeper into countries, what represents an opportunity to expand what we have already done. And to respond to this, we could go back to the SALURBAL cross-sectional evidence and think, for example, which built environment or physical factors have stronger associations with metabolic outcomes such as obesity, diabetes, and hypertension in cross-sectional analysis, and then prioritize those and focus on those factors, but now looking at repeated cross-sectional analysis, as Karen mentioned. And so are there cities with more dramatic changes than others? That's also a question. And understanding that the political, the social, the epidemiological changes during that time frame available for each country is really important to ask relevant research questions. Another example would be, okay, we know that the social environment have changed for some countries over the years. And we could also explore how social disparities have changed over time. Similar to what Monica explored in cross-sectional analysis, for example, how social disparities have changed over time on obesity and diabetes, but now looking at an average of a 12-year period. For example, how the social environment and obesity have changed within the context of the epidemiological transition and nutritional transition for each city. And also there are some anthropometric data for children, at least for Colombia and Mexico cities, and could also see and explore the evolution of the double burden of malnutrition, or the malnutrition in all its forms in children. And last but not least, we could also think that there is an opportunity to evaluate changes on risk factors or other important drivers before and after a policy or series of policies are in place. For example, Chile and Mexico have made progress on a series of food policies for obesity prevention and with the time frame available. So summarizing, our recommendation is if we want to look at how changes in exposure are associated with changes in outcomes over time, so let's consider the social, the physical, and political evolution of the countries and think what are the most important changes and drivers within the time frame available. And for that, the SALURBAL cross-sectional evidence will be definitely a good point to start thinking on the most relevant questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay, so thank you, Valeska, Daniel, and Fernanda for your insights. So now we open it up for questions. Any of the panelists has a question for any of the other ones, anyone on the audience, you can write them, raise your hand, etc. Meanwhile, while people start moving, I actually have a question for Valeska and Daniel, because you mentioned a very common thing there, which is the value of description, which I'm a big fan of that. But in my experience, I've always found hard to sell, so to speak, description papers out there, right? Like journals are like, what are you showing here? So I was wondering if you had any insights of how can we justify the use of description, right? Especially longitudinally speaking. And I was checking the paper that Valeska mentioned, which I think is a great idea to incorporate here. But how do we convince people that description is valuable?
Shall I go first, Danielle? Just because it's just, well, Usama, you know how hard it is to convince people, you know, the editors, that we are saying something important, new, and relevant for our region, no? But I think that besides the richness of the data, and I think we must show and keep saying, and I think that Latin America is under a very unequal urbanization, and I think that I didn't mention about inequity, but of course this is something very, very, very important, and I think that that's the way. I think the richness of the data, the SALURBAL data, also I think it's very important as well. But other than that, Usama, just write a nice discussion like you do, you know, all SALURBAL people does. So I don't know. I'll be happy to hear about that. Please, Daniel, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Valeska. Yes, that's a major challenge, right? And some of us have gotten reviews. In fact, the one SALURBAL paper, the one that Xavi led on walking, it was very descriptive, and two of the reviewers were, where's the statistical analysis? Where's the regression? And they were just missing the main point. And so I think in the end, what ends up happening is we add kind of an analysis that satisfies the reviewer in some ways. That's not great in some cases, but I do think that precisely Valeska's point of being a little more circumspect about the changes and more detailed and more incisive about describing the changes, which might be, again, thinking about these trajectories, or also thinking about the factors that explain the changes, would take us a little further and maybe would allow us to be more resilient to these comments that are asking for these other additions that are kind of in some ways crazy and really don't apply that well to the paper at hand. So I think that's it in a nutshell, Usama. I think sort of trying to make the analysis a little more complex and more incisive in order to sell the paper better would be helpful, and hopefully would overcome those types of comments.
I say that Rodrigo has said in the chat that there are not that many descriptive papers on urban growth in Latin American cities, that most of it is country-based. Probably that's one good avenue to highlight that heterogeneity. Olga Lucia, and then Anna had a comment there, and then Isidoro.
Thank you, Sam. I think trying to be innovative and taking risks with our reviewers, we can also combine our descriptive papers, because if we make them so complex, then also we miss the point of the description. But if we combine the description with better visualization and maybe the dashboards that we're trying to create, that probably will be of interest for some journals. So I think that could be another idea, instead of making more complex analysis.
That's great. Anna?
Yeah, I think sometimes we may be a little understated, I think, in some of our things, because I think one thing, and this is related to what Lucia was saying, one thing that we can leverage is, you know, the fact that we have data on all cities of 100,000 people or more across 11 countries, right? Sometimes I read in the papers cities of 100, but it doesn't say all cities. We have all cities of 100,000 people or more in almost the whole region. And so I think that can help elevate the importance of what we're reporting. And I think also, you know, making the case of why these trends are important to understand is also, you know, really important. And then, you know, as Daniel said, sometimes it's possible to add a little bit of analysis, just documenting, you know, quantifying the trends. I'll just tell one story. We published a paper, Pepe and I, in PNAS many years ago on the recession and life expectancy, and the paper had no statistical tests, no regression. It was just descriptive, and the reviewers, they commented on that, and we just added a very small regression analysis, and that was it. And it was the only paper. It's my most famous paper because it was picked up by Jay Leno, who thought it was very funny that recessions were good for your health. So that's the story behind that. But so yeah, that I think making the case for the breadth of the data that we have is really important.
I will add that, and this, I think it was Danielle that recommended this for one of my papers, which is to add the total population for the cities we are using. Because when we say we are using data for cities with 400 million people, representing 70% of the population of Latin America, that's very powerful as a thing.
Anna, your paper and Pepe's paper was picked up by the planning department of Bogota during the pandemic. So I mean, sometimes we don't really see the impact of that because it's not citations. So I think that's a great example.
Osama, so I have a comment about this descriptive analysis. I am a big fan of descriptive analysis. Although we are a group of researchers, we want to publish our papers. At that time, they may not accept something that are very descriptive. But at the same time, I wonder if there is any possibility to present data for, how should I say, more general audience, like Ministry of Health and other people. They never understand p-value, confidence interval. And I worked in these places before I joined the academia. I never use. I use only bar chart, line graph, but something simple, and then they can understand better. So in this sense, I saw that, well, we can make publication differently, or scientific publication for scientific work. On the other hand, when we want to engage policy makers or administrative office, I think we can use descriptive analysis very effectively.
Just to say that one of the things we've been working at Drexel separately from SALURBAL is on building dashboards that public health practitioners, people that know numbers but not necessarily regression numbers, can use easily. So to Olga Lucia's comments before and what Goro said now, I think those two things, leveraging dashboards and interactive plots for non-researchers, can be a great avenue for the future, at least. So we'll definitely engage in more of that. Valeska, although you're a panelist, you can just speak whenever.
No, well, I just want to complement what Goro said. I think that's these two kind of tracks that we are learning. We have to be very scientific, but also we have to speak to the policymakers and to the lay people, just to be understandable, because sometimes it's very difficult to make this exercise. How you would explain your paper to your mom. So it's really hard. But I think that this is a good, very good way to think about specific capacity building on that, because I don't think we learn that in school, at schools. I mean, we learn with our experience, suffering, getting rejected, something like that. But perhaps we could think some very interesting way to learn together how to do that beyond the scientific, and how to talk to people. Anyway, something like that. I would love to be enrolled in something like that.
One of the most useful things I did 2 years ago, right before the pandemic, was a training at Drexel, media training on how to talk to media. So I think that would be a great idea to do here, especially as papers go out with more impact. We have to talk to media. That would be great, because it's like the first question is always, so what? So what does this show? And in most cases with my papers, I end up with the results that are not even on the abstract of the paper, because the stuff that is on the abstract of the paper is what we care about, but go about explaining standard deviations to a journalist. So that is something that for the future I think will be greatly valuable for the project. Rodrigo?
Well, it's amazing work that you have done. My experience in Chile with Consejo Nacional de Desarrollo Urbano, which is the main, institution, I don't know what's the name of that. Well, it's a consejo that is in charge of all sort of urban development, that is more or less independent from the government. Is that they and is composed by different sectors of the society, from the Cámara Chilena de la Construcción, universities, Ministry of Transport, sort of it's a lot of people that sort of meets more or less each couple of times a month, and they simply don't understand and don't care about statistics. So when you're presenting to them, because we're in CDEUS, we're preparing sometimes sort of policy improvements, policy ideas, and this, and they have a quite powerful voice in Chilean, I would say, in Chilean politics in terms of making changes. And you can't present, you simply can't present interval data, and you have to present basically sort of descriptive and ideas based on evidence, but not very technical, because they simply don't care and don't want to listen as well either. But so this is my experience, not necessarily it's the experience of everybody here, but it's fairly straightforward what you have to present. And well, so I mean, from a point of view of policymakers, sort of descriptive papers are quite useful for make to produce changes in policies. Thank you, sorry.
Thanks, Rodrigo. And this reminds me a lot, Kathy, of the Knowledge to Policy Forum. I remember having that discussion there with a lot of the attendants there. What kind of evidence can show them, be convincing, and a few organizations there were that kind of organization, I think. Anna?
Yeah, I have one more suggestion. I think it would be important for us as a study to identify what are the top, 2, 3, potentially high impact papers that we could generate with the longitudinal data within the next year or so. And so, because that will position us well. Well, first of all, it would be a good use of the data, I think, and also would position us well for the future. So I don't know that we're ready to decide on that, but I think that would be really important for us to agree on, 2, 3 high impact, potentially high impact longitudinal papers that may be primarily descriptive, but with this big picture kind of focus, implications for what's happening now, climate, pollution, et cetera. I don't know, something for us to think about. And so focus our efforts on finalizing the data needed for those papers and moving those papers forward, as opposed to, becoming a little bit distracted with many, many different permutations, which are possible, but I don't think they're the priority for us right now. We should focus on the high impact stuff, and that the other work can come later to fill in, more of the picture.
How did you come up with a list of papers in Bogota in the first SALURBAL meeting? Because I'm wondering if that's because I wasn't there, so.
Well, on the Google site, there's a nice report. There's a nice report from the meeting if you're curious. Just brainstorming.
But we had a review process, right? I think. Yeah, that's a good point. We should go back and look at how we did that. That's a good idea.
I think thinking from what Anna was saying, I think that something that could also be interesting is that because we are pooling all cities of over 100,000 population, right? But sometimes we tend to include this in these cities in the analysis as they were all the same units, right? We don't do a distinction. And I think there might be something else important to capture of these mid-size or low or small size cities growing faster and big cities, remaining differently, that maybe the longitudinal approach could help to disentangle these differences between cities. That maybe, we are concerned about problems that are typical from big metropolitan areas, but we are leaving a little bit behind how this process could impact in mid-size or small cities growing faster. And I think maybe this longitudinal approach could help us to make differentiations across, these kind of cities, and helping, to address problems for policymakers or stakeholders in these cities that are, growing faster or having problems that may not be able to solve.
Thank you, Anna. Any of the panelists wants to chime in there?
Yeah, I think that Anna, can I?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay. No, I think that when I was preparing, thinking about that, I thought that, and look at the chat here, I thought that, Anna, this would be very interesting from the point of view of the adolescents and birth and pregnant woman, infant, anything that we think about young age. This would be very, very interesting, because here in Brazil, the cities that grows very fast from the last census compared to the 99 was exactly the medium-sized cities. And I think this makes a lot of impact on young people. So I think that this could be very interesting.
Daniel?
Yeah, just again, reflecting on that and some of the comments in the chat, even Jan's just description of two cities that are growing 10% a decade. I mean, if you think about this, in 30 years, they're probably like 40% bigger, 50% bigger in terms of compounding. That's unbelievable. So I do think that we have kind of very different phenomena happening in the very large cities. Because they're so large, they're not growing as fast, although they are growing in numbers. They're just not as fast percentage-wise as the smaller cities that have much less capacity, much less institutional ability to deal with that for planning, fiscal possibilities, and so on. So yes, that resonates very much with, I think, one of the ideas. Maybe, Anna, what I thought we did in Bogota was a brainstorm. And we kind of ended up with this really long list of papers. And then we started kind of discussing them and narrowing down until we ended up with a handful that were very, very promising. I agree with you. There's so many papers possible here. And so it's going to be easy to get distracted. So having kind of a set of priority areas would be really helpful to delivering quickly.
Great. So I don't see any hands up or anything on the chat. I have a question for Fernanda, on especially focusing on service. You mentioned something on repeated cross-sectional there, and I'm wondering if you could elaborate on that, and what's the difference between, analyzing a survey today and another survey tomorrow versus connecting them. Like how could we leverage, like if you could give us the intuition of this repeated cross-sectional analysis of service.
Yeah, well, I mentioned that actually after Carrie mentioned on her presentation that wasn't actually longitudinal, but it's not the same person over the years. It's panel data and it's survey data, national representative, which is very strong to make the point that it's national representative and to be, a strong paper and a strong idea. That was actually my idea, is not calling it longitudinal, but repeated cross-sectional. You're repeating the same measures over the years. I just want to make sure that I was in line with what Carrie what Carrie mentioned.
And can you give us an example, for example, if we think about the association between wealth and diabetes?
Yeah, well, one of the things I mentioned is, for example, the social disparities, social environment over time on obesity and diabetes changes over time. That's one of the potential ideas, looking at these repeated changes. Also, the evolution of some malnutrition forms also can be done by this.
Great, thank you. We have a couple more minutes. Rodrigo, I see you have your hand up, and then Valeska.
Yeah, Anna was asking, Ana Diaz was asking what are the sort of key papers to be right in the future. I don't know really what are, but the main, at least on the main themes, I would say in Latin American debate, urban debate, is inequities and segregation. And I agree with Danielle that you have to divide up this with think on sort of small cities, medium-sized cities, and large ones, because it's definitely not the same to be segregated in a metropolitan city like Santiago, Bogota, or Rio, or to be segregated in a sort of medium-sized city like, I don't know, Rancagua in Chile, which is 100,000 inhabitants. So, I mean, but I don't really know exactly what are the debates on urban in the entire continent. But in my opinion, segregation, inequity, and urban expansion and the features of urban expansion are key in the debate now on urban growth. And on policy on housing, informalities is and probably is quite, but I don't know. Yeah, thank you. Sorry.
Thank you, Rodrigo. Valeska?
Yeah, very quickly. This is something that I was thinking, perhaps not, to make the point in be focused. I don't know. Perhaps it would be interesting to think in one paper that could, without any health outcome, but just looking at the growth and how, like Rodrigo said, the inequity, how it grows over time. I think this, without any health event by now, would be very interesting, just to make the case that Latin American is important to be studied in terms of health. I don't know, something like that. The other thing that Fernanda said, and I mentioned, I don't think I mentioned, but it was in my slides, it was about the prevalence, because I think someone else mentioned something about prevalence in the survey data. And I think this is going to be very important to be compared in thinking about these repeated cross-sectional studies, because to compare proportion is going to be a little bit awkward, I think. So if we could use prevalence, would be much more rich, I guess.
Okay, thank you, Valeska. And I think we are out of time, so unfortunately we cannot take any more questions. But hopefully that was illuminating for everyone. It seems we have a clear consensus of the value of descriptive analysis, but at the same time, we need to understand well how to explain those in a way that is impactful, both to journals and scientists, and to media and policymakers and the general public. And also this idea of urban growth, urbanization, inequalities, and segregation as one of the driving factors, I think, potential driving factors of this analysis over time. So let's continue thinking about this. And I think we'll now move to the next session. Thank you, everyone, and thank you to the panelists and everyone that participated.
Thank you, Sama.
Thank you.
So now we have another
Thank
break.
you. Sorry.
Sorry.
Thank you.
So we're going to take another 10-minute break, and then we will come back and hear 3 more works in progress presentations and then close the meeting. So please come back in about 10 minutes.